Prime Minister David Cameron has denounced Russia for its role in Ukraine's developments, threatening to punish Moscow if it takes further steps in its western neighbour.
I think it's important we move together with our allies and partners, and I think we should be discussing whether or not to expel Russia permanently from the G8 if further steps are taken. That's the meeting we'll have on Monday, and I think that's the right way to proceed.
Speaking in the Parliament, Cameron said the best decision the UK and its allies could take is to remove Russia from the group of G8 countries permanently. Also, as you heard, this, he said, will be the case if Moscow does not stop destabilizing Ukraine. The British Prime Minister added that in an upcoming summit of the 7 major industrial countries in the Netherlands, they will consider the expulsion of Russia from the group. On the same note, Israeli's Foreign Minister Julie Bishop hinted that Russia might be disinvited from the G20 summit in Brisbane later this year. The West and Russia remain at loggerheads over Ukraine as the US and Russian ambassadors to the UN accuse each other of being behind the crisis.
The confrontation between the West and Moscow continues. The US and Russian envoys to the United Nations have traded barbs and threatened each other at a tense UN Security Council meeting over Ukraine's crisis.
The reunification of Russia and Crimea, something which our peoples have awaited for 6 decades now, in strict compliance with international law, with democratic procedures, without outside interference, and through a free referendum.
Russia is known for its literary greatness, and what you just heard from the Russian ambassador showed more imagination than Tolstoy or Chekhov.
Power described the rejoining of Crimea to Russia as theft and warned that her country is ready to slap fresh sanctions on Moscow if it continues what she called aggression in Ukraine. The Russian ambassador in response rejected Power's comments as unacceptable insults and accused the West of orchestrating the crisis. The meeting was held a day after the Russian president signed a treaty to incorporate Crimea into the Russian Federation, after an absolute majority of the peninsula residents voted in a referendum to separate from Ukraine and rejoin Russia. Meanwhile, the NATO Secretary General says Russian actions with regard to Crimea are part of an overall Kremlin strategy aimed at preventing nations from, quote, seeking Euro-Atlantic integration. Anders Fogh Rasmussen further said he expects NATO ministers to agree to beef up aid to Ukraine at an upcoming meeting.
But I see Crimea as an element in a greater pattern, in a more long-term Russian, or at least Putin, strategy.
In Kiev, the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense said Ukrainian armed forces are planning to hold military drills with the US and the UK. US President Barack Obama, however, says his country has no plans for a military action over Ukraine. Obama says even Ukrainians know that engaging Russia militarily is not good for both Washington and Kiev.
We are not going to be getting into a military excursion in Ukraine.
It seems that despite the continued threats of sanctions and isolation, the West has no real card to play in order to pressure Russia into backing down from accepting Crimea as part of its territory.